David Chen stood at the Fast Money podium on Family Feud, holding a small white device the size of a hearing aid. Except it wasn't a hearing aid, because those had stopped working for him in 2009 when progressive nerve deafness took the last frequencies he could hear. His daughter Lily, 16 years old, stood in the soundproof booth behind him, waiting to play her round after his. And David hadn't heard her voice since she was 2. Not, "Happy birthday, Dad," not, "I love you," not, "Good morning," or "Good night," or any of the 1,000 small sentences that make up a parent-child relationship. He'd learned to read lips. Lily had learned sign language. They communicated perfectly. But David would lie awake some nights, trying to remember what his daughter's voice sounded like, and coming up empty, the memory erased by 14 years of silence. When Steve Harvey handed him the device during the commercial break before Fast Money and said, "Put this in," David thought it was a joke, some kind of game show gimmick. Then Steve said 5 words that made David's hands start shaking. "Your daughter wants to talk." David looked at the booth. Lily was crying. He looked at Steve. Steve nodded toward the device. David put it in his ear, and the first thing he heard after 14 years of silence was his daughter's voice saying, "Hi, Dad. Can you hear me?" David dropped to his knees. Not from shock, from the weight of 14 years of missing something he thought was gone forever, suddenly crashing back into his world through a piece of technology his insurance had denied him 11 times. February 18, 2024. Stage 3 at the Steve Harvey Studios in Los Angeles. The Chen family from San Francisco stood opposite the Rodriguez family from Miami. Both teams in coordinated outfits, the Chens in gray, the Rodriguez crew in white. David was 48 years old, worked as a software engineer, had the kind of gentle face that made strangers trust him immediately. His wife Jennifer stood beside him, then his son Marcus, his mother-in-law Pat, and Lily, 16, high school junior, same dark hair as her father, wearing the expression kids wear when they know something their parents don't and aren't sure if the surprise will land right or blow up spectacularly. During family introductions, Steve asked David what he did. Jennifer answered because David couldn't hear the question. She signed it to him. David signed back. Jennifer spoke. "He's a software engineer." Steve asked if David was deaf. Jennifer nodded. Steve signed, "Nice to meet you," in ASL. David's face lit up. The audience applauded. Standard, heartwarming moment. Nobody knew what Lily had spent 6 months planning. What she said next would change everything, but not how anyone expected. The system hadn't failed David Chen once. It had failed him systematically, repeatedly, with the kind of precision that only comes from bureaucratic indifference operating at scale. It started in 2007, when he noticed he couldn't hear high frequencies anymore. Birdsong disappeared first. Then his daughter's voice. At 2 years old, Lily's pitch lived in a register that was the first to vanish. David went to an audiologist, got diagnosed with progressive sensory neural hearing loss. Genetic, degenerative, no cure. Hearing aids would help for a while. He got fitted for a $6,000 pair. Insurance covered $2,000. He paid the gap. The aids worked for 2 years. Then the degeneration progressed. By 2009, hearing aids weren't enough. The audiologist recommended cochlear implants, surgically implanted devices that bypass damaged parts of the ear and stimulate the auditory nerve directly. Cost: $80,000 per ear, plus surgery, plus therapy. Insurance company response: denied, deemed not medically necessary. Hearing aids are the standard treatment. David appealed. Claim denied. His doctor wrote a letter explaining that hearing aids Don't work when the nerve damage reaches a certain threshold. Claim denied. David hired a patient advocate. They submitted 40 pages of medical documentation. Claim denied. David went fully deaf in his left ear in 2011. Right ear followed in 2013. By 2014, he lived in complete silence. He learned ASL. Jennifer learned ASL. Marcus learned ASL. Lily, 8 years old, learned faster than anyone. She became her father's interpreter at parent-teacher conferences, doctor appointments, grocery stores where the cashier didn't understand why he wasn't responding to their questions. David hated it. Hated that his daughter had to be his voice. Hated that she'd taken on an adult responsibility before she hit 4th grade. Hated that the system that could restore his hearing, the technology existed, was FDA approved, was covered by insurance for other conditions, was denied to him because some administrator in a corporate office 2,000 miles away decided his deafness wasn't severe enough to warrant the expense. He applied for cochlear implants 6 more times between 2014 and 2022. Different insurance companies when he switched jobs. Same result every time. Denied. The reasoning changed. Experimental, not medically necessary, alternative treatments available, out-of-network provider, needs prior authorization that was never granted. The outcome stayed constant. David stopped applying in 2023, accepted that he'd live the rest of his life in silence, told himself it was fine, told himself he'd adapted, told himself his family didn't mind signing. All lies. Jennifer minded, not because signing was hard, but because she watched her husband disappear into isolation, stop going to social events because group conversations were impossible to follow when everyone's lips were moving at once, stop listening to music, stop watching movies without subtitles, stop existing in the hearing world, and retreat into a smaller, quieter one. Lily minded most. She loved her father. She'd learned ASL fluently. But there were things she wanted to say out loud, wanted him to hear in her voice, not read in her hands. At 14, she'd asked him what she sounded like. David had tried to remember. Described her voice at 2. High, sweet, little girl pitch. Lily said, "Dad, I'm 14. I don't sound like that anymore." David nodded. He knew. He just didn't know what she sounded like now. Lily asked if he wanted to know. David said, "Of course." Lily said, "Then let me help you hear me." David told her cochlear implants cost $160,000 for both ears, and insurance wouldn't cover them. Lily said, "I'll figure it out." She started researching. Found out that new cochlear implant technology had come out in 2022. Bone-anchored systems that cost $40,000 instead of $80,000, required less invasive surgery, had better success rates for adults with long-term deafness. She found clinical trials, found payment assistance programs, found foundations that helped fund implants for people insurance denied. She applied to 14 programs on her father's behalf. 12 said no. Family income too high. Resources should go to children who needed it more. Applicant too old for maximum benefit. 2 said, maybe, put him on a waiting list. Lily wrote letters, called program directors, sent videos of her father explaining what he'd lost, what he'd give to get it back. One foundation approved him in November 2023. Partial funding, $25,000 toward the device, family responsible for the remaining $15,000 plus surgery costs. Total out-of-pocket, $28,000. Jennifer and David didn't have $28,000. They had $4,000 in savings and a mortgage, and Marcus starting college in the fall. Lily told her mother what she'd done. Jennifer cried, told Lily it was beautiful, but they couldn't afford it. Lily said, "What if we win Family Feud?" Jennifer had submitted an application 3 months earlier, wrote about David's deafness, the family's ASL fluency, their closeness despite the communication barrier. The show called in January, offered a taping date in February. Prize for winning, $20,000. Lily did the math. $20,000 from the show, plus the $4,000 they had saved, plus the $25,000 from the foundation equals $49,000. Enough for the device and surgery, with $1,000 left over. The math worked if they won. Lily told her mother, "We have to win." Jennifer told David they'd been accepted to Family Feud. David was confused. He hadn't known they applied. Jennifer said it was a surprise, something fun for the family. David agreed to go. Lily spent the 2 weeks before the taping researching Family Feud strategy. Watched 50 episodes. Memorized common answers. Drilled her family on response speed. Her mother asked why she was so intense about a game show. Lily said, "Because Dad needs to hear my voice, and this is how we're going to make that happen." Jennifer realized her daughter had been planning this for months, had turned a game show into a funding mechanism, had weaponized hope. The game went better than any of them expected. The Chen family won 3 rounds straight. David played hard, couldn't hear the questions but could read Steve's lips, could see the board, could feel the buzzer vibrate when his team got control. Steve made accommodations without making it a spectacle. Signed questions when David looked confused. Slowed his speech so David could lip read. Turned it into a showcase of accessibility without patronizing anyone. The audience loved it. The Chens won the main game. $15,000. Close to the $20,000 they needed, but not quite. Fast money was their last chance. Jennifer played first, scored 168 points. Good, but not enough. David needed 32 points to win the full $20,000. Steve called commercial break before David's turn. Standard 5-minute reset. Lily walked up to Steve during the break, handed him a letter. Steve read it, looked at Lily, looked at David standing at the podium, looked at the producers, said, "Get Dr. Morrison on the phone, now." The producers scrambled. Dr. Sarah Morrison was an audiologist Steve's team had worked with on a previous episode where they'd helped a veteran get hearing aids. She'd mentioned during that taping that she had access to clinical trial devices. New cochlear implant technology not yet widely available, provided to select patients for free as part of research studies. Steve had kept her number. Dr. Morrison answered. Steve explained the situation. She said, "I can get him the device. It's part of a new trial, bone-anchored cochlear implant, activated externally, no surgery for the initial fitting. We can turn it on today if he qualifies. I need to see his audiograms." Lily had them, had brought every piece of her father's medical records to the taping, just in case. Steve looked at the letter Lily had written, looked at this 16-year-old who'd turned a game show appearance into a heist to steal her father's hearing back from an insurance system that had stolen it first. He made a decision. The cameras came back on. Steve walked to David, held up the device, small, white, elegant. Signed, "This is for you, from Lily. Put it in." David looked confused. Steve signed, "Trust me." David took the device, put it in his ear. Dr. Morrison had couriered it to the studio during the commercial break, arrived 7 minutes ago, was standing backstage with the activation software on a tablet. She pressed a button. The device turned on. The studio fell completely silent. David's eyes went wide. He looked at Steve. Steve was talking. David could hear him. Not perfectly. The sound was tinny, compressed, artificial, the way all cochlear implants sound at first, because the brain has to relearn how to process auditory information. But he could hear. After 14 years of silence, sound existed again. David said, "Oh my God." His voice cracked because he hadn't heard himself speak in over a decade. Didn't know if he was too loud or too quiet. Couldn't modulate because he had no auditory feedback. He sounded like someone learning to talk for the first time. The audience gasped. Jennifer covered her mouth. Marcus started crying. And Lily, standing in the soundproof booth waiting for her fast money turn, pressed the button on her mic and said, "Hi, Dad. Can you hear me?" David turned toward the booth, heard her voice for the first time since she was 2 years old. A 16-year-old's voice, lower than he remembered, richer, full of the specific timbre that makes every person's voice unique. Not the high-pitched toddler he'd been holding on to in his memory. His daughter, fully formed, speaking to him. David dropped to his knees, covered his face with his hands. Jennifer ran to him, wrapped her arms around him. The audience was on their feet. Steve stood there watching with tears streaming down his face and didn't try to hide them. But Steve wasn't done. He walked to David, knelt beside him, waited until David looked up. "Let me tell you something. 32 years ago, an old man at a gas station said, 'God's got a plan bigger than your pain.' I held on to that when I had nothing else. Your daughter just handed you that plan. She spent 6 months researching programs, writing letters, getting you approved for funding, and turning this game show into the last piece of the puzzle. She did that. A 16-year-old did what your insurance company refused to do for 14 years. And she did it because she loves you, and because the system that should have helped you decided you weren't worth the cost." David couldn't respond, just nodded. Steve kept going. "The device you're wearing is part of a clinical trial. Dr. Morrison is backstage. She's going to fit you properly after the show, get you into the program, make sure you get the full implant. But right now, your daughter is standing in that booth, waiting to play Fast Money. And for the first time in 14 years, you're going to hear her voice while she does it. You ready?" David stood up, wiped his face, nodded. Steve helped him to the podium, looked at Lily in the booth. "You ready, sweetheart?" Lily nodded. Steve started the questions, but he didn't ask them the normal way. He asked them slowly, clearly, looking at David to make sure he could hear. Between questions, he'd pause, let David process, let him hear the audience react, let him exist in sound again. Lily answered all 5 questions. The board flipped. She'd scored 122 points. Combined with Jennifer's 168, they had 290 total. 10 points over the 200 needed to win $20,000. The Chens had won. But that's not what anyone would remember. What they'd remember was David hearing the audience applaud for the first time in 14 years, hearing Steve say, "You won," hearing his daughter scream in excitement from the soundproof booth, and hearing Jennifer whisper in his ear, "We did it, baby. We got your hearing back." The audience stood, every single person. The Rodriguez family, who'd lost the game an hour ago, stood and applauded. The crew put down their cameras and clapped. Steve stood at center stage and let the moment breathe. Didn't rush it, didn't talk over it, just let David Chen stand there drowning in sound that had been absent for 5,110 days. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled out his phone, called someone on speaker. "Dr. Morrison, you still backstage?" She was. "Come out here." Dr. Morrison walked onto the stage. Steve introduced her to the audience. explained that the device David was wearing was part of a new clinical trial, that it normally cost $40,000, that the trial provided it for free to qualifying patients, that David now qualified. Dr. Morrison explained the device would need calibration, therapy, follow-up appointments, all covered by the trial, no cost. Steve looked at David. The $20,000 you just won? That's not going to medical bills. That's going to your family, college for Marcus, whatever Lily needs, whatever you and Jennifer want, because your daughter already paid for your hearing by being brave enough to ask for help when the system said no. David tried to speak, couldn't, just pulled Lily into a hug when she ran out of the booth, held her and heard her crying against his chest, and thought about all the times she'd cried in the last 14 years. Sad movies, friend drama, hard days at school, and he'd never heard it, had only felt her shoulders shake and seen her face change. Now he could hear it, the specific sound his daughter made when she cried. He'd never thought that would matter. It mattered more than anything. Steve addressed the audience. Insurance companies denied this man 11 times. 11. They said his deafness wasn't severe enough to warrant a cochlear implant. He's been completely deaf for 11 years. Complete silence. And they said not severe enough. That's not a medical decision, that's a financial one. They didn't want to pay, so they didn't. And this man lost 14 years of his daughter's voice because someone in an office somewhere decided the cost wasn't worth the benefit. That ends today, not just for David, for everyone watching who's been denied a device that could change their life. Share this story. Tag your insurance company. Make them explain why profit matters more than a father hearing his daughter say, "I love you." The episode aired 2 weeks later. The clip went viral in 45 minutes. 890 million views in 9 days. Hashtag #LetThemHear trended worldwide for 23 days. Insurance companies got flooded with complaints. 3 major insurers announced policy changes within a month, expanding cochlear implant coverage, reducing denial rates, fast-tracking appeals. Congressional representatives used the clip in hearings about insurance reform, and critically, 4,200 people who'd been denied cochlear implants resubmitted their applications. 1,847 got approved on appeal. Not because the medical evidence changed, because the public pressure became too loud to ignore. Steve established the Lily Chen Hearing Restoration Fund 6 weeks after the taping. It pays for cochlear implants, bone-anchored hearing devices, and appeals advocacy for people insurance companies deny. In the first year, the fund covered devices for 284 people across 41 states. Every recipient got a letter with their device. The system said you weren't worth the cost. Your family disagreed. So did we. Welcome back to sound. David got the full cochlear implant surgery in March 2024. Both ears. Fully funded by the clinical trial Dr. Morrison enrolled him in. He went through 3 months of auditory therapy, retraining his brain to process sound, distinguish speech from noise, filter competing audio streams the way hearing people do automatically. By June, he could hold phone conversations. By August, he went to Marcus's high school graduation and heard his son's name called. By October, he took Lily to a Taylor Swift concert because she'd been asking for 3 years and he'd always said no, because what's the point of a concert when you can't hear it? He heard it. Not perfectly. Cochlear implants don't restore hearing to normal. But he heard enough. Heard Lily singing along, heard her laughing, heard her scream when Taylor came on stage. That was enough. Lily graduated high school in 2026, valedictorian. During her speech, she said, "My dad taught me that the word no is just an opening position in a negotiation. When insurance said no to his cochlear implants, I negotiated. I found programs. I applied for funding. I turned a game show into a financing plan. And I got him to yes. Not because I'm special, because I refused to accept that my dad would spend the rest of his life in silence when the technology to fix it existed. If you're sitting here and you've been told no about something that matters, find another way. There's always another way." David was in the audience, heard every word, cried through most of it. Jennifer held his hand. Marcus recorded it on his phone. After the ceremony, Lily found her father in the crowd, said, "Did you hear my speech?" David said, "Every single word. You sounded exactly like I hoped you would." Lily asked what that meant. David said, "Strong. Like someone who doesn't take no for an answer. You got that from your mom." Lily said, "I got it from both of you." 2 years later, David still wears the cochlear implants every day, takes them off at night, wakes up to silence, puts them back in and hears Jennifer brewing coffee, Marcus on a video call in his room, Lily practicing a presentation for school. Sounds most people tune out. Sounds David catalogs because he knows what it's like to lose them. He keeps the first device, the trial one Steve handed him on stage, in a box on his dresser. Doesn't wear it anymore, but can't throw it away, because it's the device that let him hear his daughter's voice for the first time in 14 years. That's not trash. That's proof that some things the system takes away can be stolen back, if you're willing to fight, and you've got a 16-year-old who loves you enough to turn a game show into a heist. Steve did an interview a year after the episode aired. The host asked what made him call Dr. Morrison during a commercial break. Steve said, "I read Lily's letter. She'd written out the whole plan, the funding she'd secured, the gap they needed to close, why she'd brought her father to Family Feud, what she hoped would happen. She was 16 years old, and she'd turned herself into a project manager for her father's hearing restoration. I couldn't read that letter and just play the game. I had to call someone who could help. And thank God Dr. Morrison answered, because that little girl deserved to be heard, and her father deserved to hear her." The clip still circulates. Reaction channels replay it frame by frame. The moment David puts the device in, the moment he hears Lily's voice, the moment he drops to his knees, the moment Steve starts crying. The comments are hundreds of thousands deep. People sharing their own stories about insurance denials, about fighting for medical devices, about loving someone who lives in silence. And scattered through the comments, updates. My mom got approved for her cochlear implant after 8 years of denials. She heard my voice for the first time last week. Thank you for sharing this. There's a photo on Jennifer's phone she's never posted publicly. It's from the taping, taken during commercial break, right after David got the device. Lily is in the soundproof booth. David is at the podium. They're looking at each other through the glass. Lily's mouth is open mid-word. David's face is stunned. The caption Jennifer wrote, but never added. The first word she said was, "Dad." He heard it. After 14 years, he finally heard it. If this story reminded you that the people we love deserve more than what the system decides they're worth, and that sometimes getting what they need requires turning everything into a plan, a heist, a refusal to accept no when yes is possible, share it with someone who's been fighting a system that keeps saying no, and needs to know that someone else's yes might be one phone call away.